Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brodt. And today we want to get to the next episode in famous get controversies. Today, we're going to be discussing the get of Vienna, which took place in 1611 and 1612. I know nothing about this. Rabbi Brodt's going to have to fill me in at least and let me know who the characters were, which gedolim Yisrael, which Teshuvos were involved in discussing this get. And before we do that, I just want to thank our sponsor, who's anonymous, but dedicating this episode as a schus for a shidduch for Mordechai ben Bracha, and all the learning and the knowledge that's gained from these episodes should be a schus in Mordechai ben Bracha finding his zivug hagun b'karov mamish. Rabbi Brodt, how are you today?
Baruch Hashem. Okay, so here we're going to try to do this in an organized manner. We'll give you the story. The story is like this. Basically, it takes place in 1611, 1612. It originally started in Vienna and leads us to Poland. And the great gedolim of Poland of the time were all involved, as we're going to see in this presentation. And it's a great time for us, and through this, we're going to meet some of these, to discuss very, very briefly some of these great gedolim. So first, we're going to begin with the raw facts. Very raw, but we will return to more in depth about exactly what happened shortly. First, there was a young couple, which from all accounts were happily married. They were living in Vienna. The chassan's name was Avram, and the girl's name was Basheva. Avram seems to have gotten sick. It seems he was deathly ill. The doctors, it seems at one point, thought he was going to die. He was all of 16 years old, so the wife's relatives started to convince him to give a get, as she's going to end up falling to Yibum and need chalitza, all different issues, so he agreed to give a get. There was discussion if he would get better, he would remarry his wife. Okay. Now, it appears that Chashav Rabbanim were there in the city, they gave the get, everything was okay. A few weeks later, at one point, it seems he took a turn for the worst. A name was even added, Yitzchak, to his name. But eventually, he fully recovered. So now, what l'chayr should have happened was, they should have gotten remarried. But events ended up happening that they did not get remarried. But more than that, a different gadol at the time, a relative of the chassan, got involved and started stating that the get was not a get. And from there, the controversy broke out. I mean, say for a few months, it seems no one was saying anything, and then all of a sudden, a gadol gets involved, and controversy breaks out. So we hopefully will discuss what exactly was the trigger of why a gadol got involved, who the gadol was. Everything will be discussed in Mitzvah Shem.
Just an obvious question I'm thinking about, maybe a klot kasha. What's the matter if it's not a get? So they're happily married.
Right. No, in Chanami. If they're happily married, that would be great. But it seems after he got better, events happened, and she decided even though they were originally happily married, she seemed to not be interested in remarrying.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
But we'll see more about that soon. Now, so first the question is, how do we know about this story? Who was involved? Who the gedolim, and what were the exact issues behind the controversy? These are the obvious questions that one wants to know as you're hearing these very raw details. Okay, so it seems, and the point is, this is what became known as in Paiskim when they referred to it as the Get Me Vienna. Okay, so there was a Yid, Yitzchak Levin. He wrote a whole sefer on this, but sadly I have no access to it because it's in Polish. Okay, now now when we learn through this topic, the most, as we're going to see, is like this. Many times when we learn a particular Gemara or even Halacha, we wonder, especially if you're learning through Daf Yomi and all different Masechtas, you're learning Gittin, you start wondering how often do certain scenarios even play out in Halacha L'maisa. But then you look through Teshuvah Svarim and you'll see that a lot of times things that you think do not happen could happen often, and this is known as a sugya called Get Shchiv Meira. Okay, and we're going to get back to it shortly. Now, another thing is, a lot of times when one does look at Teshuvah Svarim, you see a Teshuvah, someone asks a question, and you don't really know the full story behind what's going on, but you sometimes will get to read a long Teshuvah from said Gadol about the topic. But sometimes you get lucky and there's a tshuva, and the tshuva gives you everything. What I mean to say is, in this story, the tshuva is written on the topic. They begin with like 2 pages, just first telling me the story. What was the story in Vienna? Who gave the get? What was said? And then they lead up to what the issues are, and they even give dates, which a lot of times they don't. So this story, which takes place in tshuva literature, you don't need to read academic articles, so to speak, to figure this all out, people to piece this together. You can look at the following tshuvas that I'm going to mention in one moment. But not only that, besides getting the history of where it's happening and who's involved, you also get to see the lumdus. They bring down the gemaras, their sources for everything, and they spell out everything. Mamish, pages and pages are written amongst the gedolim involved. So in all, you learn this topic. You have a lot of rich lumdus. You can see their methods, how they paskin, and you get to hear the story and understand everything. Now, fine. So the first published tshuva on this topic is published in 1619 by one of the main characters in the sugya, that is the Maharam, which we're going to discuss in one moment. He writes in his tshuvas, he publishes a tshuva on the topic where basically he's the person who causes the problems and says it's not a good get. He publishes a few tshuvas, including a few tshuvas of the Levush. He reached out to Levush, and the Levush also authored a few tshuvas published in this collection of the Maharam. And furthermore, there's a tshuva from the Maharam written to the Maharsha, which we'll discuss. Fast forward 1633, a few years later, the Teshuvah's Ma'asas Binyomin is published, and there's about 3 tshuvas on the topic. Fast forward to 1764, a long time later, and then there's a tshuva from the Sema. Now, the Sema is the person who gave the get. So now I'm basically leaking a little bit more in the story that it's a machlekes between the Sema versus the Maharam. But if you were in the 1630s and you wanted to know the details of the Sema's story, you would not necessarily know. Okay. And later on, in 1780s, a tshuva of the Bach comes to light. The Bach was also involved. And basically with these tshuvas, basically the few tshuvas in the Maharam, the tshuvas in the Ma'asas Binyomin, the tshuva of the Sema, which was published in a collection called Teshuvos Hagoyim Basroi, and the tshuvas of Bach, you basically could piece together a lot of the story, or almost everything. Okay. Of course, today I always like to bring up there's new discoveries. So they discovered, Yosef Buxbaum published a lengthier tshuva of the Sema on the topic, and Yitzhak Levine published also a manuscript of a tshuva on the topic. But okay, fine. Now, so first, who is the gedolim involved, where the events happened, and then what was the issues. So first, number one is, I said, the Sema. So who is the Sema? So we have to understand this is a period of time right after the Ramah and the Marshal. They're both nifter in the 1570s. These are the Gedolei Talmidim of the Ramah and Marshal, pretty much involved in the topic, and people already from the next generation. So number one, the Sema. Who is this? Rabbi Yeshua Valakatz. He's born in 1555, dies in 1644. He's a Rosh Hashiva in where? Lvov. He publishes on Choshen Mishpat the Sema, which is published in 1614. He's also the author of the Prisha and Drisha on the Torah. So in the world of halacha, everyone knows of him. He's very, very famous, prolific. Now, who is he? He is a Talmud of both, as he writes in his Akdama to Svarim. He was Zeicha, B'imei Charpi, Lamalti Eitzel Moir V'Rabbi, the Ramah, and the Acher of Nechnasti Lefnai Lefnim El Heichel Katshoy Shal Moir V'Rabbi Ha'olef Hagadol Reb Shlomo Lur Yazal. So B'Kitzer, he learns by the 2 great gedolim of the previous generation. Okay, and there's a lot of fascinating information about him and his methods in his Hagdama. I've mentioned in the past that sometimes Hagdamas of Svarim, you get to learn a lot about them, especially here. You learn a lot about his methods and everything like this. Now, turns out he's a relative of the Kala. And it seems that's the reason, even though he lived in Lemberg, he was visiting, and that's why he found himself in Vienna. Okay, fine. Number 2, who else is involved? There's other Dayanim. So there's another Dayan, there's a Yid. Now, we would not even know, when you learn the tshuva of the Sema doesn't even say that he's the Dayan. He talks about a case, which is sometimes what happens when you have literature of tshuvas. But after we have all 4 tshuvas, we now find out, no, the Sema is not talking about a hypothetical case that came to him. He was the Dayan in the sugya. Anyway, the second Dayan was a Yid Ramanoyach Hendel. People are familiar with him. His Agoyis are found in the back of the Gemara. Chachmas Manoyach, a great gadol who wrote a lot. Most of it has not survived. But if one wants to know more about this gadol, you could see there's an article from Yitzhak Levine, and Yeshua and Yudzayin, there's an article from my friend Moshe Chechik. And B'Kitzer, he was a very chashuv person. He was a gadol at the time. Now, it's unclear exactly all the places where he's a Rav. It appears to be that he was a Rav at some point in Vienna. How do we know this? Gufa from this Pulmus. Interestingly enough, a lot of times historians, they're always looking to find the dating of when some gadol is nifter. So it turns out there are two matzevis. One's in Vienna, which seems to have him listed on it, and there's a matzeva in Lvov, which is in a much different location. So the question is, where is he buried and what's the dating of when he dies? How do we even know that this Rabbi Noach is involved in the sugya? The way we know is, I mentioned one of the Teshuvos is written by the Ma'asas Binyomin, and we're going to see what the Ma'asas Binyomin says. That's how we know that Rabbi Noach Hendel is involved, and that's how. So not only do we know he's involved, that's how come most people accept that he was most likely a Rav in Vienna, and he dies in Vienna, and the Matzeva found in Vienna is the accurate one. Okay. Now, so these are the two people that are involved with the get, the giving the get. So in order to understand that, we're talking about two gedolei olam tekufa. Okay. Who starts the trouble, so to speak? Not to mean anything with those words, just who causes the whole thing is a Yid the Maharam. Who's the Maharam? He's born in 1558 and dies in 1616. He's also a Rosh Hashiva Weir in Lemberg, Lvov, also the same city as the Sema. He's a Rav there. He's not only does he have yeshiva, he's a Rav in the city. He's from which side of the story? It turns out he's an uncle or some relative of the Chassan side. Okay, now, some people say that the Sema and the Maharam got along. They were both Rosh Yeshivas in their own independent yeshivas in Lvov. It could be. It's hard to know. Some people say that because of this story, because of the events that led up in the story, he ended up having to leave Lvov, the Maharam. Could be also. I don't know. Now, again, so too with him. We could discuss him at great length. We know about him through the interesting Hagdama that his son publishes in his, when he publishes his father's Teshuvos, and learning through the Teshuvah Sefer of his, you could get a lot of insight into who this person is. And there's a recent edition of the Teshuvos Maharam. They also have a very worthwhile introduction, and you have Rabbi Yitzchak Levine also, again, writing an article about him, which is worthwhile. Now, one of the things we find, Keseder in his Teshuvos, that he says is he's very anti-Paiskim, that Paskin based on the Shulchan, Misifrei HaShulchan Aruch, V'Halevushim. He says this is not the way you're supposed to do it. You have to show the whole binyan of the Psak. You're not supposed to just rely on these Sfarim, which were meant for Rashi Prakim. Interestingly enough, Ramatis Yostrashon, when he talks about the acceptance of the Shulchan Aruch, he brings down all different quotes from different gedolim of this time period. We're talking about these are Talmidim or Talmidim of the Ramah, Marshal, Mamish. So he says that he quotes a lashon that the Maharam Lublin, and then he gives a list of a bunch of tshuvas, and then he says the Tishtaimem l'shmai dvarim kashim yoitzim mipi oisez zaken v'loy chafatzti latikam. It's so powerful and scary what he says. He didn't even want to quote them, and he doesn't. He just sends you to go look at them. But one of the quotes is what I just mentioned. The Kitzer, he's not a fan of the Shulchan Aruch and the Levush passing from these Svarim. Okay, fine. We know of him more. His Teshuvah Sefer, as I said, is used a lot, and it was a beautiful Rajah. But we know him when you learn Gemara and you're learning Shvar Taisvis, you turn to the back, you usually will have either the Maharsha, the Maharam, and many of the Masechtas will be able to help you out. Just to quote a very brief quote from the Meleches Machsheves from Reb Greenspan in his incredible Sefer, when he talks about the comparison of the Mahalach Halima versus the two Svarim, the Maharsha and the Maharam, he says that the Maharam is someone that he writes out everything very clearly, and you don't even need to have Iyum before the Sugya, and we right away we're able to understand what he's talking about, whereas a Maharsha, everyone knows, a Maharsha you got to break your head on. Okay, fine. Now, so he writes a bunch of tshuvas on the topic. Okay, who does he get involved? The Levush. Interestingly enough, I told you what does he say about the Levush. Okay, fine. Anyway, the Levush is considered the senior gadol in this issue. It's Mamish Seif Yamav of the Levush, as we're going to see shortly. Levush dies in 1612, also Mamish in this time. It turns out the Chachmas Manaych also dies in this time. They're both not even alive to see the whole outcome of the fight. Fine. Now, another thing we learn derech agav from we learn a lot of side things from this. I'm just going to mention one small prat. Is we learn about different gedolim that we don't even know about. L'mashal, there's a Magen Avram in a few different places. He refers to Rabbi Binyomin Av Bezin of Pozna. Who is this person? So if you look in the Teshuvah of the Levush that the Maharam publishes that he got from the Levush, he's writing that my great friend, Rabbi Binyomin Dayan Pozna, Safti Kozois Lahavas Ha'emes V'Shalom, for him specifically. When is this Zion? Erev Shabbos, Zion Adar Shinayin Beis in 1612. Anyway, if one wants to learn about him, today we know more about him thanks to an article in Yeshurim from Moshe Chechik in Chelik Tezayin. Okay, one of these obscure gedolim, again, he comes up in this controversy too. One last person to mention, and we'll see the rest as we talk about the actual topic, is the Ma'asas Binyomin. Who's the Ma'asas Binyomin? Ma'asas Binyomin, Rabbi Binyomin Salnik. He's born in 1535, dies in 1619. He's also a Talmud of the Marshal, the Ramah, the Marshal Hasheni, an incredible Teshuvah Sefer, has a tremendous impact in the world of halacha, which one day maybe we'll discuss more at length, his methods also. But he also writes...
For those keeping track of Brod's episodes, you certainly have mentioned Ma'asas Binyomin.
Yes, definitely. Now, and the Ma'asas Binyomin has a sefer that he wrote for women in Yiddish, which is called Seder Mitzvahs Nashim on Hilchas Nida Chala Hadakas Ner. He wrote in Yiddish in 1577. It's very early on in his early career. Today, it's been translated into English and also back into, even though he wrote it in Yiddish, it's been translated into Hebrew by Mechon Zichron Nahar. Okay, so these are the main gedolim, and we're going to see some more. Now, where does this machlokes take place? So, although there are teshuvas written about it, it's interesting is that if you look at the teshuvah of the Sema says everything was fine and dandy. We did the get, me and the Chachmas Manayach, and no one says anything. All of a sudden, I get to the Yerid in Yaroslau, and then I hear that Kroivim of the Chassan are getting all upset and they're making a tumult. What's going on? What does he mean with this thing called the Yerid of Yaroslau? So now we're going to sidetrack for another 3-4 minutes, and then we're going to get to the Iker. When one learns Maharsha more than once, more than twice, you'll find the following. Mikan at Seif Perik loy reisi lahalis al Sefer mechidush halachos mibnei shaloy lamalti az biyeshiva biyosi biyerid Lublin. Basically, he's at a Yerid, a fair in Lublin. Another time he says this in Sanhedrin. Loy lamalti az biyeshiva biyosi biyerid Lublin. The Kitzer is away traveling at this Yerid. What's this Yerid? So, what's important for us also is that the Taisis Yantif, also a gadol in these kufas, writes a sort of, I would call it a sort of autobiographical account of certain incidents that happened in his life called Megillas Eva. And in there he talks about the Vad Arba Ratzis. And what happened is like this, that they would gather together, and if necessary, they would make the various gzeres and charamais that were necessary. Many gedolim were together, and they would discuss the different issues, the pressing issues that was facing Klal Yisrael at the time. And he also throws in Nasati the Yerid Yaroslau b'shanahi. That used to take place where? In the Yerid Yaroslau. And then he ends off, B'nichtav b'sefer Pinkas ha'ratzos min harashi yeshivas rabbanim. They would write down the discussions, the protocols of what they discussed at these Yerids. They would have mass meetings, and they would make takanas. Lamashal and Hilchas Ribis, there's a thing called takanas hasma. Where was this discussed and brought up? At one of these such Yerids. Now, we have a work, an incredible work, from Yavinu Matzula, it's called, author of the Sharei Tzion, which we actually spoke a little bit about once in an episode of some sorts. But this Sefer Yavinu Matzula is Reb Nosson Hanover, and it's sort of a tragic an account of what happened in the years Tachvatat. And he's reflecting back, he mamish maps out how many people died in all the different cities, and he talks about Europe, what was in Poland before Tachvatat, 1648, which means he's talking about this Kufa, what was going on. So one of the things he describes is that the Rosh Yeshivas with all the Talmidim would go to a Yerid in the summer, and one of those Yeridim took place in the year, it's called Yerid Yaroslav. In the winter, it used to take place in Lvov, and sometimes it would take place in Lublin, and the Rosh Yeshivas would come and they would talk, and thousands of Bachrim would be there, and Rosh Yeshivas from all over would be there. But not only, the Yerid wasn't only for Bachrim to hack and tumble and meet other Bachrim from other Yeshivas. Also, this was a business fair. People would do business, and he says, people a lot of times, thousands of Shidduchim were made at these Yerids. Okay, this is what he talks about in the Yavinu Matzula. Another thing is, he says, this is where what's called the Vad Arba Ratzos, where they used to make great takanos, because all the Rosh Yeshivas were at this fair, the Gedolei Olam. So they would meet, they would have sessions. Also, the Askanim came. and they would have sessions, things that faced all the different cities, and they would many times there could be very lebedik fights. So basically, what we're starting to understand what's going on over here. The get was written in Vienna, and there was no reason to assume anything's going to happen, but all of a sudden it comes to the Yerid, and some gadol, we know who the gadol is, the Maharam brings up at the Yerid, I'm not happy with this get that the Sema wrote, and he addresses and he says his issues, which we're going to see mamish momentarily. Okay, so this is some of the background to the story. Now we could get to the pratim, some more pratim of actually what happened over here, and that's as follows. In the Gemara, already the Mishnayos, the Gemara, a few different places, we find something called the get shchiv meira. Now, get shchiv meira is basically someone's mamish holding. He's at death's door, and we don't want, in many cases, the issue was we don't want the wife to fall to chalitza. Sometimes it's because the brothers are in very far away place. All different. There could be all different reasons. So there's a eitzah to write a get. It's called a get shchiv meira. Now, all this tali in the sugyas, it's clear, and in the paiskim, it's also clear that this revolves a lot to do with all types of tanaim, which in Shas in general, it's very complex. So now, to write a get shchiv meira, all the halachas, and keeping in mind all issues of tanaim, is not an easy thing. So at one point, in the Tkufas HaRishonim, there were different takanas how to do this, how to write this get. So Rabbi Chilmi Paris, brought down by the Mordechai, said that they would they would have such a thing, which was it was a gerishin legamri. Beloy shum tnai. There was no tnaim. No tnaim were made. Why? Lafukin afshem mikol sveikos v'gimgum v'hayu mazikim mazkikim the kabel chayrim takanas akilas lisa zeh. They basically made they accepted that they're going to get married afterwards if lu yitzur, the person does survive, and they're going to get married. And if they don't, they're going to have to pay a large knas. But now, why was this done? Because it seems it's very complex how to work it out, and in Hilchos Tam, and we didn't want it to be problems with the get afterwards. So in order to avoid these issues, Rabbi Chilmi Paris made this takana. This takana seemed to have been accepted in Ashkenazic Polish circles. The Ramah brings it down. So you make a get. So it's no longer get shchiv meira, which has all these different fancy tnoim. It's a straight up get. Okay, and that is what was done when necessary. In cases when it was necessary, they would do that was what's called a get shchiv meira. So they removed all these complex tnoim, and they made it easier. Okay, fine. Now we have to see what happened in our story. We have, luckily, as I said, we have the Sema. We have two teshuvos of the Sema on the topic. So first, let's see what the Sema says happened. He's an eyewitness account, obviously. And then we have to see what the claims of the issues were very, very briefly. So as I said, the tainas, it's pages and pages, and it's very kedai to read briefly when one has time. But today we'll just mention some of the things. Okay, so first like this. Basically, the Sema says that he was mamish dying. He was at death's door. Kids are the krovim of the Isha. They start talking to him that she's going to need chalitza, that the wife's going to need chalitza. Okay, fine. So as I said, he calls it shnei chachamim. He doesn't say he's the chacham. Fine. But now he says like this. The chachamim, which is really him, they said, "Ein anu noisten liting get al tnai afilu b'shchiv meira." We don't give a get al tnai al b'shchiv meira. Vashchimer sheroitzel garish is ishtoi kadesha tiftar mechalitza tzarich liting get gamor beli chilukim ba'olam shatemu gureshes beget zeh v'temu teres linasei lekol misha tirtza ukichol gittin shneishn anashim briam l'nishasein ha'asoin b'Yisrael. It has to be a full-fledged get. Ukadesh lo yeh achar get kol achar b'rshus atzma lasam nashi yirtza. What do we do? Basically, he's saying it's a full-fledged get. Get that. You have to keep this in mind. Rabbi, you're dying, but you have to keep this in mind. You're dying, and it's a full-fledged get. It's not a get shchiv meira of what the Gemara originally talks about. That there's different aspects, and how do we prevent it? Basically, they're saying we're noig like this Mordechai b'shein Rabbi Chilmi Paris. Very good. Now, So even though what's important is this chassan is thinking that he's going to get married afterwards if he does get better. They're not disagreeing with that, but it has to be a real kedushin with sheva brachas and a ganze chasna and everything like that. Fine. Now, fast forward. The way the Sema brings down the story, he says this is how they wrote it down. The Bezdin wrote down the psak of the get. We out of Yom we have tons and tons of documents that survived. Most of them did not survive, but of the Pinkasim of the Gittin in old Kehilos, and he wrote down exactly this is what it is. Fine. And he says nothing's happening. No one said boo. Ad she nizdamnu be Yerid yaros lo yacha kroivim megarish. The imam chacham echad. Shehu bal doidasai shalom megarish. V'hoitzi kol laz by Yerid al get zeh shein by mamish. Who's he refer? Ella. And he says like this, that this Yid, whoever he is, we now know, I already gave you in the story, is the Maharam. And the Maharam says like this, Kol kavanasai was if his wife dies, so she's going to be putter from Chalitza, that's what it was. But if he survives, he never had such a thought process that she should be able, that she's not going to be able to have to remarry him, so to speak. Meaning to say like this, it sounds like most cases of get shchimera, there weren't happy endings. This case, sadly, in a way, had a happy ending, but that turned out to be a whole can of worms, as they say. And what's happening is, so if you're looking over here strictly al pi halacha, says the Sema, the way we paskin, and al pi pashib shat, this is how it is, and the Mordechai and this is the Ramah, it's end of discussion. It's a real get. So lo yitzur yeshi, if she pays up, it's a real get. If it isn't a real get, this is going to open up a fight there can of worms. So there's no need to give another get. If the husband saying, what do you mean the whole reason why I'm doing it? Yeah, but what would happen if he died? I'm saying that's what it is. It's a real get, full up, straight up get. Now, another issue which is brought up by the Sema is they throw out the Rabbeinu Tam, which we mentioned very briefly in the earlier episode on the Pomus Hagitin, which is not to be Moitzi Laz once a get is given. What the background of this takana requires Iyun, but this is a Rabbeinu Tam that comes up in this sugya. Also, I mentioned then that the Rami Reiner has a whole chapter dealing with it, and the Bach also, when he talks about this sugya, also throws in this Rabbeinu Tam, and a lot of the Pais can throw in the Rabbeinu Tam, whereas all of a sudden the Levush says, "Don't give me the Rabbeinu Tam. This is not a good get." We'll see why the Levush says that momentarily, and the Maharam also, "Don't give me Rabbeinu Tam. It's not a good get." Okay. Anyway, just to quote. And the Levush, just the Sema, he also brings up what I said, that you're going to need to get married again with a complete Nesuin, with a complete Erisin, with the Zion Brachos and everything. What do you think's happening? This is a real get. And if it's a real get, that means is both parties, yes, they have to give the Tanai, which was set up that they're giving the money. There's no ways around that. But technically, yes, he was happily married. But now something happened that she decided she doesn't want to marry him. Whatever happened, that there's nothing to do about it. And the Sema deals with this at length. He talks about all this and a fascinating tshuva. And he, as I said, pages and pages about it. It seems that he got a hold of the Maharam. He was at this for fear, so he knew what the Maharam's issues were, and it seems maybe he saw a copy of the. It seems that Maharam might have even published it. Kitzer, he looks at this and he deals with all the different complaints of the Maharam and says, "I'm Shuldik Maharam. I don't know what you're talking about." And he answers Raya and says that I don't go. I'm not buying into what you're saying. At one point, he says a very sharp language. And he says that he's saying things that happened that didn't happen. I'm telling you what happened. I was there. And then he says in a very sharp language or something to the effect, yeah, he's defending, but it's not true at all, and it's a good get. And he says that I proposed my whole shtickle Torah, my presentation of the sugya in Lublin at the Yerid in 1612 to defend myself. And he'd say he's not, and then at the end of the Teshuvah, he has a long list of the gedolim that agree with him. Okay, so Ad Kan, part 1 of the Sema. Comes along the Maharam. I said the Maharam is the one who's making the whole, so to speak. Obviously, we don't think like that, but the Maharam is saying it's a problem. Means say sometimes you'll hear the way people will say of the story is in a grubba ifin. We have to be very clear over here. The way I'm reading this is these are gedolei olam that are there's no he's on the side of this side, he's on the side of this side. That's the way today the internet would talk about this machlokes. I could picture already how it would be written. It would be written very simple. This gadol because he was paid off by that side. This gadol paid off on this side. We're talking about here the superstars, unbelievable gedolim, the Sema and the Maharam. Yes, the Sema is allowed to say sharp to the Maharam, but that doesn't mean that I, getting involved, could say such a thing. And the Maharam also, when I'm saying he makes trouble, I don't really mean he's making trouble. He held that this is a problem. Now, what seems over here is that what was getting the Maharam so upset is because when they discussed it with the chassan at his deathbed, they kept saying, "Don't worry, you're going to be marrying her afterwards." Okay. And then he has pages where he's dealing with Tanoim and he's dealing with all different issues and he's trying to relearn up when Rabbi Chilmi Pariz made his takana. The Maharam was a giant lamdan, and he definitely shows that through and through this tshuva. But we're talking about on the other side was the Sema, who was also a giant lamdan. They both happen to be in the same city, so I can imagine the yeshiva bachrim of both in Lvov tumbling this and passing dvarim shayim berum shalaylam in the coffee rooms and in all the sessions. We could picture it very easily. But Kitzer, he holds that this is a t'nai basically, and it doesn't make a difference. And now, he definitely, I'm saying it in an oifen that I don't understand it, but he definitely does explain it in pages and pages why he seems to hold that over here it's different, and basically it's not it's a problem, and this chassan was under the impression, and it's a problem over here, and this gets a problem, and she would need a new get because basically she is going against her and remarrying, and this was not what he meant to get to do. Okay, now the Maharam, as I said, he sends this off to other gedolim, and he has listed off at the end other gedolim besides for bringing it up at the Yerid. Now, so one of the important things was you always have to get a senior gadol at the time. So it's not only that they were talking about the Yerid, and everyone's talking about the Yerid. I'm going to see some more people about the Yerid, but he gets the Levush involved. Levush is mamish. You could see from these three teshuvos, he's holding at death's door, and he's writing at them. He's writing about this also. And at one point, the Levush, it seems, couldn't even write this teshuvah. So he suspected that people might say that he didn't write it. So he signs off. He has Adam signing it that we know that it's him, even though it's not his handwriting. But he had a kiyum of the star of that this tshuva was written by the Levush. I mean, say they preempt all the different things. Okay. Anyway, what's the Levush? The Levush also talks about the story, how he heard the story, pretty much the way the Maharam told him the story, and it seems that he must have gotten some information from how the Sema interpreted it. And he says, he also writes beyond powerful shyness. He says like this: I'm not going to bother to bring down everything that the what's his name says, that the Sema says from the thing in my tshuva. And he say they used to hire a cipher to copy the different things when they're printing up this tshuva, because who hear sham oid b'dvarim harbe v'loy tzivisi lahatikam klum rak hadvarim asher bana leim yisoidoi kashever bezus Hashem yisbarach v'gam reiti asher harayis asher hevi min hagmara al advarim anal loy tzivisi lahatikam ki kulam heim dimyonis daimis lemerubais ve'inei lemasi. And then he goes on and on. How could he say such a thing? It's terrible. The Chumra says basically saying the Sma's rayas. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Then he says, when you bring in Rabbeinu Tam, no shaykhis, he has a whole vicious paragraph about this. And he says, basically, she needs another get. What does he say in a nutshell? He says 3 lines. I mean, he has pages about it also. And he's being mechadish things in this tshuva. This is, you're seeing the Levush b'chol koich earlier. And this is what he says. He says, someone's allowing her to get married. This is a get from love. You're comparing 2 different gittim. And what he's trying to say over here is this get, the whole reason was he loved her. He didn't want her to have problems, so he set up such a thing, and then he said, okay, I'm giving the get. Lamaisa, he survived. So there was everything about this get was that now she has to marry him. Once she doesn't, this causes a whole problem. Now he goes on over here and starts talking about Hilchas Gittin, that if one gives a get, everyone knows we're going to get up to in Daf Yomi soon, Daf Tzadik, about the Machlokes Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, if you're supposed to stam give a get, if you could give a get, your wife burns the food, all these famous things that are also people like to joke about. But here he says, he's going with that in this case, this is not a get. He also knows about the Mordechai, B'Shem Rabbi Chilmi Paris, but he's saying this is different. This is the Chassan knew, and the Chassan was only doing it for this thing. So everything goes out the window. And he says like this. He says a peldic thing. When I was young, someone's dying. The women's relatives will come. They didn't want to fall to Yibam. That he could give a get. He loves his wife. It doesn't work at all. Even for this, even it means that he's asking on the whole thing that we know from the Gemaras, from Mishnayos and Gemaras that exist, this thing called get Shemera. I didn't have a good answer. Then he does attempt. He attempts to answer this with a beyond original mahalach. But the problem is that not everyone was willing to accept such a thing, because the pashtus is that's what it is. Because its gufa was because of other problems. That's why the takana was set up. That's why they dismissed all the Tanam already, and that's why the Mordechai / Rabbi Chilmi Paris earlier they went and made this takana because it could come into a churva. But in this case, the Levush was not backing down, and he held. Bottom line is that if you need a new get, if this woman is not remarrying him, the get that was given while he was on his deathbed is not good. He says that he spoke it over with people. They tried to give him a shtickle tire from a certain Taisis in Gittin. He didn't buy into that, and basically, again and again, he talks about it. And then, but not only that, it's not only that he wrote this tshuva. He writes another tshuva about it again, saying I looked into it again, and then he says another tshuva where he says I came to this conclusion. Basically, I mean to say he didn't write, even though he's dying, he made sure to feel that he felt, and he came to this conclusion, agreeing with the Maharam. Now, it's interesting is, I pointed out, the Maharam, not necessarily a fan of Levush always. Here, yeah, he is. Okay, anyway, the point is that the Levush and the Maharam are going against the Sema. We're getting close to the end, and that's like this. Another gadol I said is the Ma'asas Binyomin. He also writes 3 tshuvas. Now, when you read this tshuva, it's fascinating to see these tshuvas. Here's where you're getting to see what happened, that at the Yerid in Yaroslav in 1611, they start talking about it. And then he says there was even raid that they tried to poison this chacham. This chassan they tried to poison him. Now, it's not necessarily that that's really what happened, but this is, you're seeing the data as the Ma'asas Binyomin is saying what happens when we get to Yaroslav, which is a few months afterwards, and it becomes the tumul. This is what was going on, and he brings it up again in his tshuvas, again, more than once. At one point, he says like this, at the Yerid, they don't have no Svarim. They're sitting at a Yerid. They're in Gullus pretty much. He says, Ani akatam b'yesi tarid al Yerid, v'shmaita b'itzelusa, v'gam zois ki ein sefer b'yadi levakish layin. I had to give an opinion. And we're talking about the Ma'asas Binyomin. He knew the sugya of Get Shchemeira. He knew the relative sugyas. And he came out. So he says, the first thing he says like this. Who was the people that were Masader the get? He says it was Harav HaGadol HaMuflig Rafal Koyin. She Masader get. Muchsig HaMuflig B'chachma V'yira. Oyme B'faneinu. B'tzavach Kekruchya Ki B'chaburasoi Haya HaGoyin. Rev Hendel. B'netztarav Imoy B'nesinas HaGet. And V'loi Shamu V'loi Yagishu B'shum Tachbula V'arma B'oilam Hein B'einav V'beini Kol Nechrasim V'yotzim Rakn Achshu Shkimera Gomor. Basically, he says, I know these people. They're right here. We're not even talking about this as a fight happening to Teshuvos. The gedolim are all sitting over here. The Maharam is in the crowd. Other gedolim we're going to see are in the crowd. I have to go. I know who the Sema is. We're talking about one of the gedolim. He's defending himself. I know the Gemaras. I know what he says. So the Maharam, who wasn't there, is saying something else. Are you crazy? I hold that that's it. It's a good get. Nothing to talk about. They spoke out. This is how you learn. This is a get. This is how it has to be. and he writes this out again, Barichos in the Teshuvah, he discusses again. Then he has another Teshuvah, because it wasn't, the Maharam didn't let go, and the other gedolim got involved. This is a tumult. In the Yerid Yaroslav in 1612, says the Ma'asas Binyomin, it's brought up again. I didn't have Svarim. Again, he talks about it, and he says, no, he brings up again the poison, he brings up again it's the gedolim who's involved, that he knows them, and he says it's no problem, and he also talks about it, and then and not only that, he even writes a third Teshuvah about it. And he says he saw what the Maharam wrote, he doesn't buy into it, he goes again, what I'm saying, that this is how it works, and he also throws in the Rabbeinu Tam that we mentioned, and this is what a get is. It has to be like this. Okay, now, meaning to say like this, if we wouldn't have known the story that the family promised this chassan, that he's going to end up remarrying, it could be this whole thing wouldn't have exploded. Whereas the way the story, at least that we're seeing it is the Sema is saying that didn't play a role. We told the chassan, this is sugya, this is how we paskin, and this is how we write it. Okay, anyway, obviously we don't know all the different things going on, but the Maharam Mamish has pages and pages where he's explaining a fascinating tshuva, showing his stuff. Okay, fast forward, Nacha Gadol. I mentioned that the Ma'asas Binyomin in both cases throws out that pasking beli svarim, a fascinating thing. This is a common occurrence at the Yerid, because they didn't walk around with their laptop and Oitzah Chachman. The Rav could go say, let me go to my room and I'll paskin, let me just do some research. He's stuck, he has to be on the spot. The Bach also has this, and we have a tshuva of the Bach, and even in this sugi, the Bach's tshuva also says the same thing. I'm at the Yerid, no svarim, whatever. He writes a whole tshuva, again, dealing with defending the Sema on the topic. In his chibur on Shulchan Aruch, he says the same thing, quoting the sources, and he's writing this 25 years later, close to Sefer Yamav. He's saying, yes, there was Lerech Chafei Shana Nasa Maisa B'Kalkin of Vienna Shegadol Achronim Masad to get l'Shchimera v'Yimagarish. Okay, fine. Who's another gadol involved? The Maharsha. Here, the Maharsha is one of the great gedolim also of this time, a contemporary of the Maharam. We know him from the Chiddushei Maharsha, both on halachos and haggadis in the back of the Gemara. Fine. There's a cryptic thing. All of a sudden, if one learns Gittin, you'll see the last Maharsha. The Maharsha starts talking. He says, "Mitamol." The Maharsha a lot of times doesn't really talk halacha in specific black and white. A lot of times you can infer halachas from what he says. But he says like this: "L'man yedu adayris lavin alayris beget shchiv meira." Shenoisnim b'doiris halalu b'stam b'li shum tnai apitikon ari mi Paris. Hine acharei asher zachiti bezes Hashem yisbarach lu my mesechtes gittin amarti ki yisoidu ba'atzmi masher pirish Rabbeinu Tam, based on the sugya of Milchemes Beis David and Basheva, and therefore he says get shchimer shon reisim b'li shum tnai alefi shelo oisin kem betzina b'shchimer yekaisim ram lisna tikanu sheyia oisin sheduchem echad beknas v'cheim l'kainzik kishan mechad zen nearly bar agam kikfar kasafti dvarim kimashon compassion with the kind of zoom of her is. But Kitzer, he says it's a get gomer kimosh kasafti kfar berayis v'chachos mikomakam amarti l'halis al sefer davar shenchatzul b'zeh. That he's basically saying that this is relating to Nacha Sugya, which is known as the Sugya of Yerid Milchemes Beis David. Okay, now what's going on over here? So it's clear, and people point this out. L'malshal Ruva Margolis on the Sefer on the Maharsha, which we mentioned on one of the podcasts earlier. It's referring to this story of the Maharam. Now, like all folk literature, people are always wondering, what's the story? What's the yachas between the Maharsha and the Maharam? Some people say they didn't get along. Some people say they did get along. Some people say this fight caused them not to get along. The problem is, when you look in the Maharam Milublin, when he writes a tshuva to the Maharsha about this, he calls him Oy Havai. I don't think he would write such a lashon if he was real, and he didn't really mean it. Because I'd have a argue with him, la halacha. But anyway, there was no evil intentions over here. Just the Maharsha was writing at the end of Gittin. This is my shita. This is a chamer de kazach. It was a hot topic in the time, and the Maharsha was also at this Yerid, as we mentioned earlier. He was always at these Yerids. Okay, the Beis Shmuel and the Sire Shulchan Aruch, he also goes with this. He brings down the Maharam Lublin and others, and the Taz also obviously he goes over here like the Bach. Bekitzer, what's happening over here is that we have the Gedolei Olam at the time are handling the fundamentals of what's the halacha. It got very lebed, it got very heated, and as I said, if one learns through these tshuvas and you're holding a Masechtas Gittin, you'll find it fascinating to see all the different ins and outs. Now, just to be Messiah over here, many different gedolim were involved. We're not going to list them all out, but In later generations, it seems one post note is it's for some reason they ended up giving another get. I'm not sure why, because it seems so strong that so many gedolim didn't want to give a get. They not only that in Hilchos Gittin, it seems very problematic not to give another get if you don't have to, but another get was given. Lamaisa the Chachmas Adam in his Binas Adam, that's the Chayi Adam. He also seems to be saying that we go with in a different tshuva, but a similar based on the materials and the tshuvas of the get Shchimei Rav, this get me Vienna, like the consensus, not like the Maharam Levush. Interestingly enough, there's a Mishkanas Yaakov who he goes like the Maharam. He has a tshuva specifically also from the sugi of David and Masheva, where the Maharsha went one way to say that that's going to prove not like the Maharam. He used it to prove the Maharam. Kedarka B'Kodesh, she's always being mechadish interesting things. The Aruch HaShulchan, which is always very kedai to see how he sets up Simon Kuf Memhei and Hilchos in this sugya. The first two sifim, he brings interesting materials, and at the end also he argues very sharp against the Mishkanas Yaakov. He says this is how it has to be. He spells it out very, very clearly. Also very kedai if someone doesn't have the chance to learn through all the tshuvas about it. And then just to conclude, but the last thing is like this. This is much more relative than we realize, because especially once the Mishkanas Yaakov and the Maharsha are hitting it into David and Basheva, soldiers went to war, and there was something Ada Yoin is known as Gitei Milchama, which is its own fascinating topic. If one wants to read up about it and see how this plays out in it a little bit, Reb Zevin in his La'ar Halacha, one of his classic works, has a major parak called Milchama. In the Parak Milchama, he has something known as Gitei Milchama, where he deals with the sugya. Adkan, some of the interesting points of this get that rocked the world in 1611, 1612.
Wow. As I mentioned at the beginning, you certainly informed me of a lot of information. Fascinating. All the gedolim that are involved. And I know that you could do a whole series on the topic of Yerid, what goes on at these Yeridim.
Yeah, exactly.
You've mentioned it in the past. I'm sure there's a lot written about it.
It's very important right now, because it's interesting is we're recording the episode in the Yerid. Yerid, a lot of times, that was when Bein Hazmanim. Bein Hazmanim is about to begin officially next week. But more than that, you know when this get was? In Yud Aleph Av. Mamish we're holding in the time when this chassan a few hundred years ago was sick. It could be that when this episode's going to go live is actually going to be Yud Aleph Av. I hold that's a murder Siyata Shmaya for all the Rebbes. You like to always bring them in, so you can bring them in for the Siyata Shmaya of this topic.
Amazing. Okay, it's almost Shabbos by you, but we can't let you go before you turn around and pull out a Sefer and give the audience another glimpse of something that is exciting to the Rabbi Doctor in his library behind you.
Okay, so here we'll go very briefly as the time is close to Shabbos. It's called Sich Yitzchak on Tefillah. This is how it looks. And this is like this. There was a great Levush Gadol, a Levush Gadol who dies in London in 1966. His name was Tzvi Hirschfarber. And fascinating Yid. And he wrote a lot, but mostly he published his Torah. It was published on Chumash, Mayadim, and all different types of things, and on Avis, Haggadah Shal Pesach, and he also wrote a Chibur on Siddur. And he would sit in libraries in London, and it seems he also had a lot of Svarim, and he would put together his own materials, adding to them fascinating material. So he put out a work called Sich Tzvi on the Siddur. Okay, Mice, it's been out of print for a while. Recently, it seems some people in Eretz Yisrael are very big fans of his. I'm not sure if they're related to the Mechaber themselves, and they've been starting to publish his materials. And basically, they went ahead, they got new material from him from the Siddur, and they're going to turn this one volume into two volumes. So volume 1 is Chol, volume 2, I guess, is going to be Shabbos. They got new materials that he had in his collection that I guess wasn't published, and they also did an amazing thing. A lot of times he would say, I am Mashakasafti in this Sefer, and this Sefer. Not everyone has those Svarim, so they brought you all the things on the bottom that he quotes. He also quoted a lot of times rare Svarim, so they would bring it on the bottom. So this is a few hundred pages. Just came out, mamish, less than a month ago. It's 375 pages on Yimai Chol, davening from Tzvi Hirschfarber.
Very interesting. Nachi Weinstein of the Svarim Chatter podcast had, I believe, a great-grandson of this Rabbi Farber, who I think he has a fascinating story how they got involved in starting to reprint some of the content of their Elter Zayda. Fascinating story. It's worth listening to. Just the story of like one of his children who used to sit at the Shabbos table and was repeating over some of the stuff that they found in Shas Farim, like for a project, started putting together like weekly Divrei Torah to send out, and that's how the whole project started. Now they obviously have ended up with this beautiful Sefer and the Siddur.
They
Yeah,
did. I
some
think
other
they did. They did first. They did first Haggadah Shal Pesach. Now they went to the Siddur. But I'll tell you something else interesting. I don't know if they mentioned on this thing is that this Ritzi Farber left behind an autobiography. I randomly came across that he left behind such an autobiography in an article. I once bought a Sefer, a book. There was a collection of articles, and the back of the book, this guy did a Meir de Getaiva. He used to collect articles in newspapers about gedolim, and he would put it in this book. So when I got the book, I bought in a used bookstore, they left in all these papers. So not only did I get a bunch of articles about a bunch of gedolim in this book, but I got articles that this guy collected from journals in London about all different gedolim. And one there was an article about Tzvi Farber, who I have all the svarim, but I all of a sudden see that he had an autobiography. They wrote about it there. All of a sudden, I'm very curious what's going on. Does it exist? I do some detective work and find out that Rabbi Penny Dunner owns the autobiography and was working on publishing it. I then reached out to him at the time, and I got it transcribed, and hopefully one day it will come out with Rabbi Dunner's notes and everything. But it's a fascinating thing to learn about the world of Lita and of London, fascinating stuff in this autobiography.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rabbi Dr. Brodt. Have yourself a wonderful Shabbos.